Welcome back to Emma Woodhouse. We are talking today about your non-fiction for Pen and Sword about Mary Carr. So, just in case people didn't listen to the last episode yet or they've forgotten about it, you wrote a Mary Carr novel that came out at least a year ago, I'm going to say. Was it roughly this time last year?
February last
February
year.
last year, as a novel. But you'd been researching Mary Carr then for a year or two at that point, quite a long time actually.
Yeah, completely.
Most people would say, right, brilliant, let's find a new topic. But you decided to write it up as a non-fiction book. So how did that come about?
That came about because when I research, I tend to make a scrapbook. And I made this scrapbook full of evidence of Mary Carr's life. And I finished writing the novel, and I can remember holding the scrapbook in my hand and thinking, there's a non-fiction book here. And I wasn't really ready to say goodbye to her at that point. And so what I did was I had a glass of wine and thought it would be a good idea to get in touch with a publisher and say, would you like me to write a non-fiction book about her? And they said yes, and I ended up writing my non-fiction book about her, which yeah, it took my research in different ways to the sort of trajectory almost that it had been on. I presumed that my research was complete, and it wasn't.
Well, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that not only is it never complete, but sometimes you find the best things after you've submitted the manuscript as
Mm.
well, which is frustrating to say the least. But you, even after 2 or 3 years of Mary, you thought there was more in it, and you did find more in the end as well. So that's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots more. And it was really good to have time to look at the people that she sort of hanging around with as well a little bit in a little bit more detail. So I ended up doing much sort of wider research, the areas that she was living in and into the people that she was sort of affiliated with and the people that who had a bit of a vendetta against her and also looking at some of the theories that have been put forward by other people that have written about her as well, trying to get to the bottom of could that have been true? Could that have not have been true?
Well, we were talking in the last episode about representing the dead and trying to be faithful to them and so on. But I feel like when you're doing a non-fiction book, they're not actually dead to you.
Mm.
They actually come alive in some strange way. And certainly, so a lot of my work was based on Peaky Blinders, which I never really watched as a fan until afterwards. But I think when you get into that level of detail, you do feel like they're still alive, right? You're right into their present.
Yeah, absolutely. With my novels as well. I mean, obviously, when you're writing a novel, you've got to really get into that character. But when you are faced with all of this research and all of these facts, yeah, they absolutely do come alive. I can remember in our first chat last year when I said that I feel as if the Victorian era for me is very close and I can just reach out and touch it. And you talked about your research and how close that feels to you. And I think it is that, isn't it? You end up knowing so much about them, and you've imagined them in different scenarios and in interactions with different people so much that they really do become part of your life.
They do every bit as much as a fiction character
Mm.
needs to as well. Um, we've talked about how addictive the research is, but they do occupy a lot of your waking time, don't they? It is somewhat it's all consuming. Um, Although it is nice to go to work sometimes and get a break from it, isn't it? It's nice to have both things going on. In fact, I remember from my when I was learning to write and reading about Stephen King's writing and so on, he obviously a professional writer is he hasn't really done anything else his whole life. But he only writes for like 2 or 3 hours a day, actual solid writing time, and the rest is the business stuff around the side or trying to relax or think of the next thing. So I don't think you can do this for 70, 80, 90 hours a week at the keyboard. We write when we're pretty much doing anything else as well in our heads, don't we? So were there any particular differences between the novel and the non-fiction in terms of the process? So one of the things with a novel is, of course, people can fill gaps with their imagination. So if there isn't a proof of a certain thing happening,
Mm.
for example, back in the day, it's very likely to have a recording of a conversation. Like
Yeah.
it's so difficult then to record conversations. You had to make up any dialogue based on what you knew of the characters. Is there a big difference between the process, or do you think somebody could do both?
I think There is actually a word for, well, two words that sort of describe the sort of way that I work when I'm writing my novels about real people. And I didn't realize that it was a proper thing. I just presumed I was attempting to write in a realistic fashion. But I'm currently doing a master's in contemporary creative writing with Northeastern University London. And after talking to one of my lecturers, and she said, you need to look at critical fabulation. And critical fabulation is essentially what I've been doing with my novel writing, in that you take research and then you try to fill in the gaps. For me, that's the way that I do it when I'm sort of researching a real person and putting them into a novel and trying to make it as realistic as possible. But when it comes to the non-fiction, obviously you don't have that need to fill those gaps as much. One of the things that I've really enjoyed doing with the non-fiction is when you've got a piece of evidence that could be interpreted in a couple of different ways, and some historians might just interpret it in one way, but I like to say, well, if you look at it like this could have been what happened. But if you look at it like this is another possibility of how it could have happened. So I like to leave things open to for the reader to kind of look at the evidence and sort of make their own minds up a little bit as well. So I don't want to sort of shove a piece of evidence under the nose and say this definitely means this, if there's a few possibilities of sort of interpretation. So I've quite enjoyed doing that with the non-fiction. Whereas when I was writing about Mary with the fiction, of course, I had to interpret something in a definitive way in order to tell the story. So that's been quite a sort of nice way to sort of work with the non-fiction.
Well, it's always nice to hear that there's a kind of theory or philosophy behind an approach that you've just kind of worked out or feel like you've worked out for yourself.
Mm.
Maybe that gives it not credibility, but maybe it gives it sort of like gives you confidence that you
Yes.
are doing something that's academically
Yeah,
recognized.
well, that's what I thought. Oh, there's a word for this. It was quite sort of nice to sort of know that I was doing something because, when you start out as a writer, there's a you always feel like imposter syndrome almost. Am I any good? Am I doing this correctly? Am I doing justice to this historical figure and all the rest of it? So yeah, that it was a nice sort of moment of, oh, I'm doing something that's quite a nice, a well thought of thing to do. So that's good.
So do you find that just trying to think about the way I write, but what do you think about the kind of pressure? Do you feel like there's more expectation or pressure on a non-fiction book? Because obviously you've got to get everything right. I'm always worried that I'm going to quote something wrong, I'm going to
Mm,
forget a reference. Has somebody used AI as the new thing?
right.
Is there more pressure with non-fiction? Do you live in fear of being found out more than you do with the novels?
Obviously, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves for starters. The thing about history is that because history is an interpretation of evidence, and if you read a book that was written in say the 1980s about something historical, and you read a book on the same subject that's been written, this year, they're probably going to have slightly different things to say because interpretations alter over time. The sort of presenting of history, for me, I suppose in a way I've attempted to present history and not necessarily say this is a definitive, I'm telling you definitively what happened. In my book, I'm saying this is the evidence. This is the evidence. This is the social picture. This is, sort of who was there. This is potentially an interpretation of what that means, rather than me saying this is true and this is true and this is true. So hopefully I've kind of taken that stress away from myself a little bit because I don't want to say that I'm definitively right in an interpretation because actually, you get two people who've had a conversation 2 weeks ago and one of them will think that something was said slightly differently to another one. So how can I be a definitive judge about something that happened 200 years ago that I've just seen a prison record for or a newspaper report for? So um, I think it's very easy for us to try and pick apart a sort of historian, but actually we're just discussing something we weren't there at the time to discuss. Hopefully, the way I've presented it shows that, this is the evidence, this is it, this is what it could mean, this is what it could mean. Make your own mind up a little bit.
Although we're writing non-fiction, we're talking mainly about non-fiction today. We're
Mm,
not writing sort of academic non-fiction in the sense that it's important to get our facts right, but it's also
mhm,
important that people buy the book and read the book, right? And
mhm,
there are people, some people who inspire me, like John Ronson, who very specifically sets out to
Mm.
write a page turner. It's all real,
Yes.
but he structures it in the
Yeah.
style of a thriller.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether you had any thoughts on that. In other words, I do you structure your non-fiction like a novel, basically, or anything like that?
The non the my so my Mary Carr is my first non-fiction, and I've structured it. I've attempted to structure it chronologically, but I've also structured it so that each chapter looks at something that's been said about her and then dissects it, looks at the evidence, then kind of reconstructs it into a potential summary that may have one answer or may have a couple of different interpretations. So, um, I suppose I've not really structured that as a in the same way that I would a novel at all. Um, I love a good John Ronson, by the way. I've got a number of his books. He's brilliant, isn't he? But um, yeah, I think what I've done is I've attempted to look at things that have been said about her, either because of A Thousand Blows coming out and people sort of writing a lot about her in the press recently.
So I had a subsidiary question about because I've been thinking about the differences between writing online and writing a book, and I'm doing both of these things like constantly. And I do find in a book, I'm very mindful that it's going to be around for a lot longer. The shelf life is a lot longer. The gestation period is a lot longer. It takes like a year after I've finished it to even hit the shelves, maybe 10 months, but certainly about a year. So everything's much more thought through and methodical and more neutral as well. So I write a lot on Substack, and this is going out primarily on Substack. And I find that you want to be a bit provocative in a blog post because you need people to subscribe and follow and all that stuff we're told to do. You don't write online as much, do you? Do you want to do more of that, or do you is that something you might have thought of doing and ruled out?
Yeah, I started on Substack, but I found I've had a such an intense year that Substack has sort of fallen by the wayside a little bit. I did really enjoy. I've written a few things. I called myself Forgotten Voices, and I was looking at again because it's my obsession about women who did certain things that would not have sort of gelled really with their working class Victorian sort of origins. So I wrote about a swindler who is one of my favourite people that I sort of unearthed when I was looking at Mary Carr. Her name's Tottie Fay. She's in my non-fiction book as well because she would have known Mary Carr. Um, and I wrote about a working class woman who became a poet and had works published, and sort of varying different sort of women and their sort of stories, but all from a Victorian working class origin. And I really, really enjoyed it, but I found that it was such a lot of work on top of everything else that I've been doing this year, that it's fallen by the wayside. So I'm hoping to find time to pick it up again. Um, but the books have had to come first because I've had deadlines, unfortunately, and it's been such a heavy year that I've just not been able to sort of pick it back up. But it is a very different way of writing. It's got to be a lot more succinct. So I'm looking at the life story of this woman, and I'm having to put it into a little sort of Substack article. And yeah, it's a very it's a summary really of their sort of most interesting points rather than I like to delve quite deeply into the details and the backstory and the sort of social history and all the rest of it. And you don't have masses of time for that on your Substack. But it is another way of getting across a really interesting piece of history in a flash. Um, and it looks like a flash to a reader, but actually it takes you quite a long time, doesn't it, to eke out the most important bits and to put it in the order that you want it. And it's quite time consuming. So, I mean, you must spend absolutely ages on yours.
Well, sometimes, yeah, sometimes it's so I'm finding if you see the research as a separate entity almost, you can do a bunch of research, and then that can be a resource for lots of different things, actually, whether it's a novel or a non-fiction book. I so when I've finished my current book, a music book, my plan is to Substack elements of it, but not nothing that's going to go in the book, but kind of subsidiary topics that I found out along the
Mm.
way, maybe that wasn't didn't fit into the book or didn't have time or it's not quite as on the topic as it should be. But I've got all these loose ends that I can then exploit in different ways, if you like,
Yeah.
which is how I've come to see it. Because I think the research is so time consuming
Yeah.
that maybe I don't want to close the door on the topic either, and I want to try and find new ways to keep it going. And obviously, there's a theory that that will sell more books,
Hmm.
but also on its own, the Substack might be something that gets readers and an audience. And like Instagram, I'll put very small thoughts on Instagram
Yeah.
that are relevant to my research that I have no intention of putting in the book. So there's not really very much science to it, but there's a feeling behind it and a method behind it, even
Yes.
if it somewhat seems a bit random to some people. We're just doing something to fill time in a way
Yeah.
that's enjoyable and fun. But what I found this year is that definitely less is more, that if you do a bit less stuff, you can do it higher quality and hopefully you'll get more notice, right?
Yeah.
If you start putting out second-rate stuff that's full of holes, somebody will pick you up on that,
Yeah.
and then that just takes the edge off it, doesn't it? Even though it's a hobby, right?
Yes.
But we've talked kind of generally about the process and the pros and cons and so on. But coming back more specifically to Mary Carr,
Mhm.
you told me, or somehow I found out about this connection to a very famous artist. First of all, questioning whether he is very famous. For people who don't know who Frederick Leighton is, could you give us a minute on who he is? Was he, how well known was he?
Well, he was the president of the Royal Academy for many, many years. So, yeah, he was incredibly famous in his day, and he was part of the Holland Park Circle, which was a group of artists that all lived around Kensington in almost a circle, and very, very celebrated artist. And most people, I believe that most people, if they don't know his name, would recognise one or another of his paintings.
So, what is his connection? His amazing connection, really, to Mary Carr. What have you found out about that?
So, allegedly, he came across Mary Carr in Piccadilly Circus, and she was selling flowers. And a newspaper article written by an artist's model um, stated that he was drawn to her because of her violet eyes and her glorious hair. And he allegedly gave her his card and asked her to model for him. Now, Frederick Leighton had a lot of models. They would go to his house and they would model. He's got this, I mean, his house is open to the public. Um, and the artist's studio is this gorgeous, huge room with a sort of one window that's floor to ceiling glass. And he had it built especially for his art. In fact, the whole house was built especially to his requirements. It's only actually got one bedroom, but it's an enormous mansion. And it was built because he'd got a collection of beautiful tiles that he'd amassed, and he wanted a room created for these tiles, and he had a silk room created where he could have his silk on the wall and, sort of artworks displayed. And it's an incredible place to go and visit, but apparently models often went in pairs to his house, didn't tend to go alone. But he had a particular model who he was very fond of, and her name was Dorothy Dean, and she was an actress. And she used to go off on tour every so often. Um, and when you see a picture of Dorothy Dean, and he was very good at painting her, because he painted her a lot, and he painted her sisters as well. But when you look at a picture of her and you read a description of Mary Carr, I believe that there was quite a physical resemblance. So in hair colour, facially, potentially as well. Um, but also one of the things that I later realised that Frederick Leighton didn't paint faces particularly, as in he didn't look at his model's face and paint it as it was. He stated that he painted faces that he sort of painted what he felt like it should be like almost. Um, so we do have particular paintings that could have been Mary, that could have part of Mary in them. Um, but the face is not necessarily going to be Mary's face because this sort of claim of his that he didn't necessarily paint exactly what was in front of him. Um, I've got a bit of a theory that maybe he could use Mary as a bit of a stand-in when Dorothy Dean was off. She went on tour to America and places. Um, and so potentially he could have used Mary as a bit of a stand-in for her. Um, there are some of his paintings, the painting that's mentioned by one particular model that could have Mary in it is called the Bath of Psyche, which very clearly has Dorothy Dean's face. When you look at that painting, it very much looks like Dorothy Dean's face, and it's a very sort of slender painting of sort of nude with a bit of sort of see-through material draped across her standing in front of a pool. And it's potentially Mary might have modelled a bit for that. But we also have a painting called The Girl with the Golden Hair or The Maid with the Golden Hair, um, which is basically a fully dressed female sitting reading a book with some glorious sort of um, blonde hair kind of cascading over her shoulders, um, which is sort of around the right period as well. And when you look at the face of that model, it's less like Dorothy Dean. And more like the descriptions that we've got of Mary. And when we think about Mary as well, we've got two very different newspaper article drawings of her. And in one of those newspaper articles, her face is quite long and her chin is quite long. Um, and the face in the girl with the golden hair is more like that face. So, potentially she could have modelled for that. And there are a few other paintings as well that were sort of painted around the right time. There's a very large painting called Captive Andromache. And if you know what Dorothy Dean's face looks like, you can find her at least three times in that painting. So he was very sort of used to sort of painting her features. But, um, you know, Mary potentially could have modelled as part of that as well. And what he did do as well was he took sketches first. So when you go to his house and you look in the study, they've got a lot of his sketches around the place. Um, on sort of brown paper and some, gives you quite a chill to walk in there and think, one of these could be her looking back at me. That face that could belong to her, that torso could belong to her.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, it's definitely worth a visit. I've been to the house a couple of times and it's yeah, definitely it's an eye opener and you can imagine the models were let up the back stairs, so up to the artist studio, there's a very slender staircase that goes up that the models would have gone up, so they didn't go through the nice part of the house. They were considered staff, and they'd have been sort of snuck up that little staircase and into the back of the art studio and would have modelled for him. So it's a fantastic sort of story that we've got this woman who was blackmailing judges and doing all sorts of things and stealing stuff. And yet then she was going to this incredible mansion in Kensington and modelling for the president of the Royal Academy.
It's an amazing story. That's Leighton House in Holland Park, isn't it? And that's
Yeah.
still open to the public now. But I suppose that's one thing, just to close out the conversation where we're talking about fiction. If this was a novel, you would absolutely just use that because it's such a brilliant idea.
Mm,
Whether it's true or not doesn't matter to me. It's just a fabulous possibility. He obviously knew of Mary, that's not been disputed. It's just whether she was a model or not. I think everybody would want to believe that she was.
yeah.
And certainly in A Thousand Blows, Erin Doherty's portrayal is a very glamorous Mary. She does a very certain scams and crimes that she
Mm,
has to look like a lady. So she has got the potential for passing off as a member of the aristocracy, and that would fit in with being the model as well. It's an
yeah,
amazing possibility, isn't it?
it is. Yeah.
So thank you, Emma. That's a great place to finish on. And I think when you're looking back a certain length of time, although I'm looking at a much more recent time at the moment, and you find that facts are very hard to come by, even if you do eventually figure out the factual information, it sometimes takes so long and sometimes it leads to just more questions. So I'll just say thank you, Emma, for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
And it's been really nice talking to you again.